gang. Here's to nights that turn into mornings and friends that turn into family. Cheers!
Hello, and welcome to the Friendship IRL podcast. I'm your host, Alex Alexander. My friends, they would tell you I like to ask the hard questions. You know who I am in the group. I'm the person that's saying, okay, I'm going to ask this question, but don't feel like you have to answer it. And now I can be that friend for you too. Let's talk about money. I am so freaking excited for this conversation because talking about money and friendship has been on my list for so long. And let me tell you right now that this will not be the last conversation that we have about money and friendship on this podcast. There will be many, many more. I've just been waiting for the right episode to appear that is kind of this like foundational friendship money episode. And today's episode is just that. So we'll get into more nuanced topics, more specific examples in later episodes. Now, you might be wondering why I am so passionate about money and friendship. And I can tell you right now that my friends and I talk about money all the time. Like, I'm going to give you so many examples in this episode from my own life of the things that my friends and I are talking about. And I personally feel like there has been so much power in having these conversations with my friends that it has immensely helped me and them to be open on whatever level that is. And you will hear about this whole idea of like the levels of money conversations in this episode. But what I have seen with my own eyes is that when you lean in and talk about money with friends, it can have so many positive outcomes. You suddenly might have people that will hold you accountable, or you will save hours and hours of time because one small conversation could save you hours and hours of research. It might lead to the opportunity to just sit around one evening with your friends and talk about why they are making the choices they are making with their finances, so that you can spend some time reflecting on whether or not those would work for you. Now, I have said this in other episodes. When it comes to your connections, but really any area of your life, we all are working with so many resources. I always talk about resources in a few categories. I talk about your time, your attention, your energy, and your finances. So in my mind, if I can have some conversations with the people in my life that either help them or help me or help my community, help the greater good, to give us more of those resources to go after our other life goals, I'm all in. I am all in. Let's have those conversations. Now, before we dive into today's episode, I want to tell you just a little bit about today's guest. Sarah Roller is a financial coach specifically for women and new parents. She helps her clients create a personalized plan for proactively managing their money in ways that allows them to enjoy their life today while also creating the future that they want. Let's just dive in. Let's dive in because I can't wait to hear what you all think of this episode. Hi, Sarah. I am so excited for today's podcast episode because we are talking about a subject that I have been dying to bring to the podcast. This will be, I'm sure, the first of many episodes I do, because we're talking about friendship and money. Can you tell us a little bit about your work?
Yeah. So I am a financial coach, which is not a job that most people have heard of. Basically, I help people get their financial life in order. Typically, it's people who are maybe not quite ready for a financial advisor. They are struggling to save. They're struggling to make financial progress. A lot of times they come to me saying, I feel like I'm starting to make good money. why does this not feel easier? I help them, understand their spending habits, create goals that are actually sustainable, figure out habits that can help them maintain those goals or stick with those habits long term, and really just take a holistic look at their financial picture. Because so much of kind of generic money advice that you see out there is not necessarily bad, but I think it's really hard to know, when does this apply to me? Is this relevant for my lifestyle, my priorities, my goals? And just really kind of consolidating all of that to help create a plan for you as an individual.
I love that a financial coach exists. So many people need that. I mean, finance just has so much stigma and shame and, ways that you quote unquote should do it. Are those even the right ways anymore? And I know that, as we're going to talk about in today's episode, money is a really big topic actually that my friends and I discuss all the time, but I know that's a rarity and that most people are trying to go this alone. So having someone that they can trust to help them navigate is so important. Like the work you're doing is so important.
Yes, I have so many clients who in our first session, they'll tell me something like how much debt they have or something that feels possibly shameful to them. And they'll say, "You are the first person I've ever told this to." I feel so honored and, thrilled that they're willing to share that with me. But I wish that it wasn't so taboo and that they had other people in their lives that they could share it with. I always, at the beginning of working with clients, I tell them, this is a safe, confidential space. But also when I say confidential, that is like from my end. I want you to feel comfortable having these conversations with your friends. So if anything we talk about comes up with your friends, please open those conversations.
So I think that talking about money with your friends is so powerful. And the reason I think that is because people quite often they are friends with, not always. We love an intergenerational friendship around here, but quite often they are kind of in that same season of life. And the way that things work now in 2023, and whatever that season is, whether it is just having graduated college and figuring out what your first, how to pay rent and even just do your budget, whether it's moving in with a significant other, whether it's maximizing credit points, whether it's paying off credit card debt, whatever it is, whether it's buying a house, like all these things, quite often your friends are in like a similar scenario, or they have been in recent times, or they might be. And the way that they are approaching these problems, like if you can crowdsource information, that information is so much more relevant than, let's say, no offense to our parents, what our parents did, because like times were very, very different. So there's so much power in sharing information, especially about something so important like finances. Like that's why I want it to not be taboo to talk about this anymore.
Yes. And I think for so many people, where we learn about money is primarily from our parents. Sometimes it's direct, and our parents taught us how to balance a checkbook, if you are old enough for that to have been a relevant thing. Oftentimes it's not something that's explicitly talked about by our parents, but we still pick up on whatever they modeled. But as you said, it is often not relevant. But I think there are parents, and we have this ingrained sense of they know everything and whatever they say must be a universal truth. But you're absolutely right that times have changed, people's priorities have changed, the economy has changed so much that I think it's really important that we have other influences as well.
Yeah, influences, resources. I mean, I think one of the biggest things that I experience with money is just like crowdsourcing how people have done it. And that doesn't mean that it's the right way at all. I could hear it and be like, oh, that is not for me. But then I know it's not a judgment on them. It's just like information collection from firsthand sources versus I think what a lot of people do is like read, Reddit. I mean, I'm hoping some people are out there tapping into some of the financial experts on the internet. I mean, I know I do that, but where are we getting this information? If we're not spreading it, where are we getting it and how much do we really trust the sources? Do you have that problem when people come to you?
Yes. And I think also a lot of people often are not even seeking it out because it's shameful and it's uncomfortable. And we figure out a system that worked for us when we were 25 and had our first job, and it gets the job done. So we just kind of slowly evolve that system. But if you were to start fresh, you would probably have created such a different system for yourself. So I think sometimes kind of reevaluating what's working for you and what's not working. And to your point, hearing what your friends are doing can be so enlightening. They're like, oh, you can have multiple savings accounts that are dedicated to different savings goals. The banks let you do that? That's a question I get often, that it's such a simple thing, but we just don't know what the options are if we don't hear from other people. And because it's so private, often we just don't hear from other people. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Understanding who to trust. I think, unfortunately, the financial industry, there are people who are quite predatory. There are people who are willing to sell you a universal life insurance policy that's probably not a good fit for you. And if you don't feel confident asking the questions, or even what questions you should be asking, it is kind of easy to be taken advantage of. So yes, I do get a lot of people who are afraid to do anything because they're afraid they're going to get scammed.
Well, I'm hoping that today's episode will inspire some people with ways they might talk about their friends or with their friends or their community, or just in general, like not making this such a taboo subject and figuring out the personal levels that somebody wants to disclose at when it comes to money. Because I think that's the other thing, is that quite often it's like, oh, well, if you're going to talk about money, you feel like you have to tell your friends the balance of your bank account, the amount in your savings. Like, you don't have to do that. And that's really what we're going to try and talk about today. Is you and I came up with some levels of starting to discuss money with your friends. And before we dive into these, I also want to note, just because you're at maybe one level with one friend doesn't mean you have to be at that level with everybody. That you can pick and choose who you want to open up with. Before we get started on the levels, do you have any other things you want to say about friends? And
I think there's so many conversations you can have around money that are like adjacent to those actual numbers. And I think there's absolutely a time and a place where sharing specific numbers can be a great thing. But there's so much before you even get to that. And I think talking about money is so vulnerable. Money is tied to worth and power. I'm not saying it should be, but inevitably, if your friend tells you how much they're making and it's significantly more than you, it's pretty natural that you're going to make some conclusions about their worth, even if you're trying not to do that. So recognizing that that's just kind of how our brains are wired, and kind of giving yourself grace there. I mean, I think the allure of having something like Zillow is so powerful, because we can, for once, actually see, what did your friend spend on that house? You know, anytime someone you know buys a house, what is the first thing you do? You look at Zillow. And I think everyone is very curious, because you just don't get access like that. But I think keeping these conversations kind of behind closed doors really is mostly beneficial to people in power, you know, by not talking about salaries in a transparent way. The people who benefit are the companies. It is never the individual employees. So to whatever extent you're comfortable leaning into having at least a little bit more transparency, I think is really helpful.
I mean, the house point is so interesting. That's such a great example, because, right, like we can look up what somebody paid for a house, then to go to this whole like layers thing we're about to discuss. It's like, did you get financial help from your family for that? Did you hit 20% down, or did you have to pay private mortgage insurance? Could you afford that mortgage? If it's a dual income household, could you afford that mortgage on one salary? Like, those are some of the back end questions that don't have to do with numbers, but are very enlighten your friends on how they might also be able to do it. And maybe they can't. Maybe they don't have the same fact pattern.
I think that's a really important thing to understand. If you're seeing all of your friends buy houses and you're like, why can they do it? Why is it so easy for them and it's not for me? To even if it doesn't change the situation, to at least understand it's because of family support. It's because they are two lawyers making a very different salary, because they didn't have student loans, whatever it might be.
Because they had an inheritance from a grandparent. It's because,
Exactly.
Like there are so many pieces behind that number. And if you can start to discuss those, then you can understand kind of all those factors at play. You can look at your own fact pattern. You know, maybe they got like some loan somehow. You know, I have friends, for example, who house hack. And I've asked all sorts of questions about how they house hack. Like, what does that look like? What kind of loans can you get? What does it look like when you move out? How long do you have to live in that house? Like, these are the kinds of things that could help someone versus just looking at the cost of the house and saying, oh, I could never do that. Or how did they do that? Well, I don't know. How did they?
Yeah. Yeah. And even if it's someone who has a very similar income background from you, it could be that they have not taken a vacation in the last 5 years. They have spent very differently to get there. Or maybe they're making a wildly irresponsible decision buying this house, and it is going to be something that is regrettable. But when you just see that Zillow listing, you don't know all of that.
When Sarah and I chatted before we hit record, we laid out what we thought were kind of some levels for how to talk about money with your friends. Because you aren't necessarily going to jump in and talk about the most vulnerable of questions or the most specific of numbers with your friends. That would be intense. That's a lot. So how do you build into having money conversations? How can you start talking about money and honestly, maybe not even talk about yourself or your own money, and then kind of build into talking about yourself and getting a little more specific over time? So before we get into this, I want to just list out the 5 layers we came up with. And then you'll hear us dive into each layer with so many specifics and examples. So the first layer, layer 1, is just being open to talking about money in general with friends. Just honestly stating like, hey, I've been thinking about my finances. That's level 1. Level 2 is talking about the resources you're looking at related to finance and why. Basically, why somebody, whether it is you or not, it doesn't need to be personal to you, might make that financial choice. Who would that work for? Why would they do that? What life circumstances? The third level is talking about money goals, your own money goals. The fourth level is talking about mechanics, as in like the different types of accounts or the scenarios and situations that you personally are working in. Now, notice that we've gone through 4 levels of talking about money, and there's so much power and so much value in having those conversations. And not once have we talked about a single number. So the 5th layer is actually talking numbers. And even in there, there's some kind of layers to how vulnerable, it's not like you need to like lay out all your finances for somebody. So now we're going to dive back into the episode. You're going to hear so many specific ideas and examples and conversations and nuances and scenarios for each of those layers. And before we get into that, I just want to remind you that you may never reach the highest layer. Like the only goal is to do whatever feels right to you. But maybe this will give you a new framework to think about what does feel right to you. And maybe you'll be a little more open to having these conversations with friends on whatever level that is. Okay, I think that's a great segue into kind of these levels that we've come up with. So the first level we said was even just saying to people around you, kind of like making a nod to the fact that you are open to conversations that relate to finance. Do you have any tips on how people might do that or like what that looks like?
Yeah, I think it's really helpful to kind of lead with vulnerability. So being willing to share either some of your struggles or even some of your wins. If you are, 1 month away from paying off your student loans, go ahead and share that. But I think especially leaning into struggles or things you have questions about, again, not with specific numbers, but it could be, how did you decide what to put into your 401k or what to invest in your 401k? Or I'm thinking of getting a new credit card. Do you have any recommendations? That's a really non-threatening way. Someone can easily say, nope, I'm bad at money. I don't have any suggestions, and close that conversation if that's something they're not into and it's not too threatening. But it also opens the door in a more open-ended way that they can elaborate that and share whatever insights or maybe reciprocate with their own question.
There's even like the most basic of just saying like, hey, I'm thinking a lot about money lately. You don't even need to have a conversation. Just like tell people this is a priority that you're thinking about. And maybe they'll have more conversations around you that involve money where you can just listen. Maybe you have something to contribute. Like, I think just giving people a sense that this is on your mind, great foundational. And then as you mentioned, some of the like resources and mechanics. So the resources, like what budgeting apps are you using? How are you tracking your spending? The credit card, as you mentioned, what other resources can we think of?
And I mean, it could be also asking for recommendations for professional services. Do you have a CPA? Do you have a financial advisor or a financial coach? Those are all great specific questions that, again, are not asking any great vulnerability. But I also think it's a really important thing to make sure that you follow up with a "and why" question, because I've seen so many people who have tried the budgeting app that their friends were raving about, or that they were referred to a financial advisor or something like that, and it's not a good fit for the friend. And they don't know why. The pain points that the initial friend was trying to solve with this budgeting app, advisor, CPA might not be the same pain points that you have. So really understanding, that's great. I love that you need a budget, which is a very popular budgeting app, works for you. Can I ask you why? What do you love about it? Who do you think that this would be a good product for? And seeing, does that fit with, where I'm struggling?
I mean, that's a great call out. And I think that goes back to this idea of like, that's an actual conversation about finance with a friend that has substance. Like, sure, I can just say, I use X budgeting app. Just like you could scroll through the comments on Instagram and read a bunch of names of apps. The magic in the friendship piece is that why, like you're saying, like that's like the slight layer more. And quite often, I think there can be this idea that like, if I'm not sharing my exact budget with you and opening it up and handing it to you, like, then it's not useful, but it is useful. That like that why question is useful. And there could be some vulnerability there in, like, oh, we keep going over in a couple categories every month. And this has really helped get me and my partner on the same page. But again, it's not numbers. Like there is some vulnerability here, but hopefully it's like a layer that a good number of people in your life you could trust with that layer.
Yeah, and getting data points from a few different people, I think, is really helpful. And I know I am absolutely guilty of giving what I thought was good advice earlier in my financial journey because it was good advice for me. So, for example, I pay for pretty much everything on credit cards. I kind of dabbled in the credit card point game for a little bit. I have really backed off, but I still enjoy, I'd rather get a point than not. If there's any fraud, that is more secure on a credit card than a debit card. So for a lot of reasons, using a credit card for just about everything makes sense for me. But what I'm not saying is that I consistently pay off my credit card in full every month. Interest fees are kind of irrelevant to me because of that. So I have definitely told friends that they should use their credit card for everything and left out that critical piece of This only applies if you are consistently paying your bills in full every month. This doesn't apply if having a new credit card is going to encourage you to spend more. In that case, my advice was wildly unhelpful. And it wasn't until I learned more, in this particular case, learned more about this friend's situation to realize, oh, I need to walk back what I said, because in that situation, what is going to be helpful for you is very different.
Yeah. So interesting. I also am like, you can't obviously know all of your friends' like that's the thing. I would know with a good number of my friends at this point, because we've had enough financial conversations, like maybe how I can filter. But that is an interesting piece with the finances. Like there's a little bit of weight here in these conversations. Like you don't want to just have them like totally flippantly, the way you would suggest like how to buy a fan for your bedroom.
Yeah. And I don't think it's on you to necessarily know. I mean, if this is the beginning of the conversation that leads to all of this nuance that helps color that picture, fantastic. If this is, your first or second money conversation with a friend, you probably don't know all of that nuance. But I think that's why it's important, if you're the one asking the questions or if you're the one kind of sharing your experience, to lean into that why and not just leave it at, I like, you need a budget, end of sentence. I think if this is your first money conversation, that in and of itself might feel like a bit vulnerable, but really kind of pushing yourself to explain what are the reasons that this is a good fit. And maybe if you can think of like who it might not be a good fit for, can also be helpful. And then they can self-select if this is appropriate advice for them or not.
Here are my 2 takeaways from this section now that I'm listening to it again. Number 1, it's going to take a moment to fill in the color when it comes to talking money with your friends. So what I mean by that is if you're brave enough to start talking about money with your friends for the first time, remember that you don't have that much information yet. And you're going to need to ask a lot of questions to start to get to a place where you can just maybe take someone's recommendation the very first time because they have a understanding, like enough of an understanding about your financial situation or values or choices or how you have your system set up so far. So number 1, when you get the courage up, it's going to take a minute. Number 2 is just like, honestly, any other area of life, we should probably be going to a few sources. So if you open up with one friend about money, that's great and wonderful, but you maybe should be also talking to a coach or reading some resources from authors who talk about finance, or speak to a couple other friends. That we shouldn't just go in blindly and listen to one person. That really the whole point of talking about your finances, in my mind, is kind of this information gathering. So many of us are doing that by reading books or watching financial content online, perhaps hiring a coach or a financial advisor. And we can be doing that same information gathering to a certain extent, that same information gathering from our friends and our connections and the people in our life. I also think a great way to go about this with your friends, kind of at this resources layer, is sharing like what you're reading, what you're watching, share it back and forth, and then have a conversation and say like, oh, did you see the interest rate is that high? Which then might prompt your friend to say, oh, I didn't even really think about it because I pay off every month. And then whether you disclose that you don't pay off your credit card bill every month or not, you can just be like, oh, interesting. Okay. And then you can choose, and maybe you decide later to share. But sometimes I think just like sharing the resources back and forth and having it be a full conversation versus one question of why, and then you move on. It also is a great way to like just practice talking about money.
Yeah. And when it's a article or a TV show or something like that, it's a little bit removed from you, which often feels a little bit safer and is a great kind of entryway.
And could be a conversation where you share an article and then, you read it and you're like, well, who would this work for? It may not be either of you. Now we're just talking hypothetical. And again, like removing yourself might make it easier to start having these conversations about money.
Absolutely.
The next kind of layer we came up with was talking about your money goals. And I could talk about this one all the time, but I'm going to let you start with talking about money goals because I have some personal stories to share about this one.
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, just kind of naming your priorities to yourself is hugely impactful. Understanding what you're working towards makes it a lot easier to effectively work towards that. But sharing that with your friends, one, it's a huge bonding component to let your friends know what you're excited about, what you're working towards. But I think it's also really helpful in explaining if there's areas that you might be restricting your spending in order to serve a larger goal. To say, I can't go on this girls' trip and you're kind of embarrassed because it's too expensive and you don't want to pay the money, that can be awkward and uncomfortable. But if you say, I can't go on this girls' trip because I'm trying to pay off the last of my credit card and I'm just a few months away and I don't want to lose progress, most friends are going to be pretty excited for you. And they're not going to be mad that you didn't join them or saying, hey, instead of brunch, can we switch it up and just make it a coffee date? I'm trying to build up my emergency fund because maybe you're looking to quit your job and focus on your side hustle and you just want to build up that runway. Like if you kind of take the initiative and explain why you want to change how you're spending as a group, most people are excited to support you if they understand why.
So I have so many stories. Money goals are huge with our friends. That is like big, celebrated, discussed, new money goals. At this point, it's like you kind of come up with your money goal and pretty soon after somebody probably knows what it is. But I have a friend and at some point I want to have her on this podcast, but the same when I was talking about the house hacking, she very young decided that she wanted to do like the coast fire life kind of ish. I mean, she's not like firm on that, but I mean, like she's got a lot of money goals. Let's just put it that way. She's got a lot of money goals and we're in our mid 30s. She's bought a couple of rental properties. Like she has a plan. She's done a lot of research and there are definitely things that she will spend on and things that she will not spend on. And I think she could have very easily just, been like, oh, I can't do this. I can't do that. I can't do this. But because we know that this is her bigger goal and we're honestly like cheering her on and checking in and like asking how close she is to another rental property and, like, oh, a few more years, like, great. We're so excited for you. But it does mean that we've had to ask a lot of questions like, okay, well, what do you want to spend on? She doesn't love to go out and spend on big fancy dinners in town, but she will travel with us always. So we have some sense of like, okay, well, if we're all going to get together, not to say she'll never go out for like a celebratory dinner, but she would prefer to go hang out at somebody's house or go on a walk or go to the park or get coffee or window shop or do something, like literally anything other than go out and do a big multi-course dinner. And like we know that. And so we just respect that and we pick different activities. But it makes it very easy for us to even know, like, not that we're never going to invite her, let's say, to a big fancy dinner, but like she may say no. And that's okay.
You don't expect, that she's necessarily
that she's going to say yes, for sure.
And you don't take it personally, because I think that's the thing that a lot of people are afraid of, that if they say no, maybe they won't get invited again. Maybe they're going to hurt someone's feelings. Giving them insight as to why you're making those decisions, where your priorities are. And I mean, I think that's fantastic that your friend made it clear that big dinners, not really of value to me, but a trip I am willing to spend there. Understanding that about someone, I think, is really helpful. But I do think it's also important to highlight that sometimes when we change our behavior, there can be a cost to friendships. If your best friend that you always went out to expensive dinners with, and now you've decided maybe that's not such a priority, if that's the thing you always did, it can have an impact on the friendship. Not saying you shouldn't allow that behavior to change, but I think also sometimes, you get that friend who's decided to become vegan and they make you feel bad that you're eating meat. And, I think sometimes there can be that in money, even if you aren't projecting that, if they see you making different money choices and they kind of used to think of you as being the same, and now you're making different money choices and they're not ready to make a change, or they just aren't interested in making a change, which is totally fair. We can't control how other people perceive our behaviors sometimes.
I was just going to breeze on by. And then Sarah pointed out something incredibly important, and I'm so freaking grateful that she did. So this idea that it can be particularly hard when a friend changes something, like has a new boundary, is making different choices than in the past, and it impacts the way you're spending time together. So in this case, whether it is building up your emergency fund or going vegan, doesn't really matter. This isn't specific to money. And now that friend where you get together every month for a big fancy dinner no longer wants to do that activity. Like, now what do we do? And that is why I created my roots framework. Now, this is your first time listening to the podcast, or you've never heard about this before. I have this framework called the Roots of Connection. You can find it on my website. You can go listen to episode 12 of the podcast. It's a full breakdown. But basically, it's this framework for how to think about our friendships and connections. Like, what is holding your friendship together? And in this case, one of the things that was holding your friendship together was those regular dinners. And now they're gone. So what do we do about it? I want to say, like, I call this a root dying or withering. Maybe it's not gone forever. Maybe they just want to do it less frequently. That would be a withering. But there's a piece of this where you need to, mourn that things are different. Like, you're totally allowed to do that. You're totally allowed to be frustrated for a minute. This was the pattern you two had. But that's only going to get you so far if you want to keep this friendship alive. You got to do the mourning, but then you have to proactively build new roots. So what does that mean? In this case, it would mean talking to your friend and saying, hey, bummer, the dinners are ending. That's been really fun. You can spend your own time mourning that this is gone, but I think you're allowed to acknowledge that you're bummed. This has been fun. And then you'd say, but I'm so proud of you for, let's say, they're shifting their financial priorities because they're going to grad school. So they can't be going out to these fancy dinners every month. So you're allowed to say, bummer these have ended. They've been so fun. I've really enjoyed them. But I'm so proud of you for deciding you're going to go back to grad school and shifting your finances there. What can we replace these with? And that conversation allows you to acknowledge you've enjoyed this, to tell your friend you're proud of them, and then on the third beat, to be proactive and find something new to replace this. I don't know what that would be. Maybe it would be walks or coffee dates or cooking at one of your houses because that's less expensive. Maybe it's work/study dates. I don't know what the answer is, but you can figure that out and navigate it within these new parameters. So I'm really, really grateful that Sarah pointed this out because it really is this bigger conversation. And it's so common with money that your friend might just say, no, I can't make it because you aren't used to having these types of money conversations. But if you can get here, it makes it so much easier to be proactive and have that conversation and build new roots that align with this new season of life that your friend is in, that respect everybody's goals, that still keep you connected.
Yeah, I agree with you on all that. The first piece about people making different choices, it's no different than if somebody stops drinking. So if this was your friend that you went out to fancy dinners with and they are starting a new business and funneling a bunch of money into their business and their budget has greatly changed and they can't go do that anymore, that is no different than somebody deciding they don't want to drink anymore or people becoming new parents and they don't have the time. We all have resources, whether it is financial, emotional, time, energy, that we are investing into our relationships. And when our resources change in whatever way, it affects the ways we spend time together. So I guess I'm just trying to call that out, because if you're struggling so hard with that with money, one, it might be because money is like a charged subject for you. Or two, it might just be that overall you're not very good at those shifts. And that would probably be something you should look at in general, because that's going to help your friendships overall.
Yeah, I was thinking, especially for people who are a bit of a people pleaser, it's hard to be the one to say, can we shift to a cheaper outing? But how much is that people pleasing tendency costing you is a really, I think, insightful way to look at it too.
And there's so many layers there. Like a good example of that one, like the shifting. I love an app called Splitwise. Splitwise sponsor me. And they have, I would love to work with you. My friends use you all the time. They also have an app, like a secondary app that's not their main app, called Plates. I don't know if you've ever used Plates.
I have not used Plates, no, but I'm writing it down.
So Plates allows you to take the bill at a restaurant and put each item in, like the subtotal, the tax, the tip, and then you can put, I don't know how many, I honestly, probably up to freaking 20 people, because I've literally used this with like 20 people. And it allows you to like split out who had what. And you can split a certain item between a subset of people. And I know that some people are going to be like, that's so annoying. But I want to explain. We have some friends who like, we can totally go out and we know that they also value a nice dinner out and they can afford it. And we're not worried about it. Like we could split the check with them. That's fine. We also have friends where, we're not picking as expensive of a restaurant because they have another goal related to money that is not going out fancy. So we're going to go to like the taco truck and we're going to have just as great of a time. There are also people where, especially in a big group, this Plates app is really helpful, because we kind of as a friend group made this decision really early on that we wanted people to be able to come out and be mindful of their own finances. We want them to join. We don't want the fact that they know the bill is going to get split evenly and they didn't drink and they made different choices. We don't want them to say no. So the Plates app allows for somebody who is maybe watching their finances, whether we know it or not, doesn't matter, to come and hang out and join, and they can order a less expensive item. They can partake in less. Basically, they have control over their final bill, and they're not going to be saddled with the fact that people just kept ordering things. And that's really important to us as friends, because then it is one less barrier of participating.
I love that. I am definitely looking that up, because it's so awkward when you feel like an ass having to like, are we splitting this evenly? Or I just had a salad and water. And it's so uncomfortable as you're watching your friends order another round and another round. And it really takes the fun out of it. But if everyone knows going in what the deal is, it makes it so much easier for everyone to enjoy it.
Anybody who's listening to this, unless you're like really, really sure, and maybe it's like one other friend or one other couple or whatever, and you're like really positive it's fine, I would highly recommend this app, especially for a larger group. I get with like a couple people or two couples or whatever, it's pretty easy to ask for separate bills normally. But even with like two couples, we will put this in, because like, what if somebody's not drinking right now? What if I don't even need to give it? Like, what if we just want people to feel like they have some sense of control, because otherwise they may never want to go out to dinner with us again. And that's not what we want. So I would highly, highly recommend this Plates app.
Yeah. And I think, you might be a person who's like, it's fine, I'll get dinner this time, you get it next time, or we'll just split it. It all kind of evens out. And that's great if that works for you. And if you're with all people who feel strongly about that, fantastic. But I think it's really important to consider the perspectives of other people and often the unvoiced perspectives. Sometimes you can speculate what that might be, and sometimes you can't because people might not tell you that they have a ton of student loan debt or credit card debt or are sending money to their aging parents so that their parents can still afford their mortgage or whatever it might be. I think that's great. Just recognizing that we're not all in the same situation.
And if you are those people who like to do the back and forth, I would also suggest the Splitwise app, because we have had friends that we do, are very present, like we do a lot of things with them, friends, and we've just kept it running Splitwise, where if you picked up, they were driving over and they picked something up extra for you that you asked for, they'll put it in there, and that's $10. And when it gets to a certain amount, maybe, I don't know, 25, 50, 100, whatever your limit is, you make sure and cash it out. But quite often we just kind of like let it run. And then that even will be the reason it's like, oh, I owe you $50. Like, why don't I pick up this dinner kind of thing? So we don't do that as much anymore. We're a little older now, but when we were younger, I mean, we did that with all sorts of friends to like make it equal.
Yeah. And even if it does come out to be a wash, just like highlighting that you're concerned about it being equitable, I think is important.
And just paying attention to it, because we have all had that one friend who is just like convinced that they're always the one that picks up the tab, but they never are. This is a great way to just like, we know now. And that's easy. Before we dive into the next section, which is talking mechanics, I just want to let you know that we go in hard and then we back it up on this section. We did it kind of backwards. We got so excited, and by we, I mean mainly me. I love talking mechanics with my friends, so I'm jumping into like account types, taxes, wills. And at the end of this section, thank you, Sarah. This is why you're the financial coach. Sarah comes in with some simpler things like your monthly Netflix subscription and just more basic things. So just so you know, don't be terrified. There is a more entry level way to talk mechanics than the way we start this section off. We'll get there. So the next level we had was talking about mechanics. And we've kind of touched on this, but this idea of like, what credit cards are you using? In my mind, this is a little more specific. This is starting to have those questions of like, oh, well, do you pay off your balance every month? Have you ever done a credit card transfer? What types of retirement accounts are you using? And again, we're not sharing numbers, but we're sharing like the accounts and the reasons, and maybe even like some more personal layers of why we're making these choices.
Yeah. And I think, definitely the types of accounts, do you have multiple checking accounts or savings accounts? Do you have a high yield savings account? That's a thing that I think a lot of people don't fully even understand what a high yield savings account is. And for so long, savings accounts have had, almost non-existent interest rates. So it seems like, what's the point in even trying? But having a high yield savings account now is somewhere around 4.5%, which if you have an emergency fund with upwards of $10,000, that's a meaningful return that is worth opening, and a pretty easy switch if you just haven't had anyone point that out to you. That's a lot of lost potential money. I also think, we talked a little bit before, but like, how are you paying for things? Are you paying for everything on a credit card, a debit card, cash? Do you have a reason for that? You may have never considered why you would pay for things differently, but your friend might say, oh, I try to pay for all restaurants in cash because I just spend less and I'm more mindful. And okay, never had that thought process. That's really helpful. Maybe I might apply that either to that or some other category that I'm trying to spend more mindfully. But yeah, understanding the processes and the why, I think, is really important.
I could give so many examples for this like mechanics thing. Types of accounts. I do have some friends who credit card hack or, points, whatever. So asking how they do that. How many cards are they opening? What are their spends? Like, oh, the 24/7 rule. Like, just learning, asking, like, sure, I could follow an influencer, but friends who give pretty specific answers of like why they're opening this card and doing this thing. And I don't know how much they spend on those cards. I don't know what kinds of things they spend on those cards. All I know is that they have those cards. I mean, I'm married to a tax accountant, so we have friends who talk about taxes. We have friends who talk about, still in finance, but we're in our mid to late 30s. A lot of my friends talking about how their parents' wills are set up. And it's not again about money. It's just about like, are there trusts? Are you the power of attorney? Like literally talking about that kind of stuff.
That's a fascinating question that honestly is not something that I've talked about with too many of my friends, but it's something that I'm talking about. My grandmother passed away this summer, so it's been something in my family, my extended family, that has come up a lot. And in my family is very open in terms of those, well, talking about death and to some extent talking about money is probably less taboo in my family than most. But for most families, it's such an uncomfortable topic, asking your parents about their retirement plans or, are you secure? Is there a chance you might be dependent on me, depending on how things go? That's a really important question to ask. Should you be setting money aside in case your parent ends up in an expensive retirement home and their retirement plan runs out?
Like I said, we talk with our friends about a lot of things. And like, I have some sense of what friends are going to have to kind of be responsible, what friends their parents have maybe already bought into retirement community and like paid a deposit, which ones have long-term care insurance. And it's not so much about those things. I mean, a little bit, it's like, oh, should I be talking to my parent about long-term care insurance? Like, why did your parents choose to do that? It's also, I think, some understanding about like the responsibility that is on all of us, that something could happen and you suddenly need to move someone in with you. That's a big implication. Like understanding there's a lot of pressure that we're all under that we don't even know and maybe hasn't even happened yet, but we know is a responsibility that is going to fall on us.
Mm-hmm. I'll interject with, if your parents are the ones who are really uncomfortable having this conversation, because there are a lot of parents who are very uncomfortable having this conversation with their kids. Maybe it's just such a taboo topic that they just don't want to have it with anyone. Maybe there's a weird, you're an adult now and I'm going to become possibly sort of the child in the relationship. Like that's or just the mortality conversation is uncomfortable. So many ways that can be an uncomfortable conversation. For those parents, having a direct conversation is particularly challenging. But if you can say, my friend just told me about what happened with their parents, something that didn't go well, or something that like they just had this set up. My friend told me that their parent signed them up as the power of attorney. I just realized that's something I should ask you about.
Yeah.
Have you explored that? If you can relate it to someone else, that makes it so much less tense to kind of indirectly ask those questions of your parents. So definitely recommend that, if nothing else, to be able to find an easier opening with your own parents.
Yeah, there's just so many layers. I mean, who had student loan debt? Who did not? Who is still paying it? Right? Like that is impacting people. That's a lot of weight somebody's carrying. Who has had kids? Who wants to have kids and is like putting money aside? Like, I mean, those are kind of more maybe those goal pieces, but there's so much mechanics underneath all of this that can be discussed.
Are you thinking of having kids? What are you doing to be prepared for that is definitely an important question. And I mean, especially if anyone has to go, the IVF fertility treatment route, that's incredibly expensive. I mean, for so many reasons that isn't generally talked about for, because we don't like to talk about, pregnancy loss and all of that. Couple that with not wanting to talk about money. That's a really hard thing to talk about. How are you financing your IVF treatments? But yeah, that's definitely a piece of that reality too.
So as people can see, there are so many layers of mechanics we could be talking about. And I'm sorry for anybody we've just terrified because you're like, I haven't thought about a lot of those things. But what I would say is there's probably someone around you who has. And if these conversations are more open, then it's not that you have to have it all figured out. Because there are things I've definitely mentioned here, like I don't have it all figured out, but there are conversations where I'm learning what friends are doing. I'm doing my own research and then bringing it back to discuss. I just think that when we talk about the mechanics or the goals or the resources, the knowledge share is so powerful when you have more people's brains looking at all this stuff than just your own. And we haven't even said a single specific number up until this point of the podcast. And there's still so much power in this.
And to maybe take it to a lighter point, one other mechanics question that I love is asking about if there's any bills that you've been able to negotiate or some other like budget hack or bill that you've been able to cut. Maybe that's we cut cable and we're loving it. We don't miss it. Or we cut cable and there's this one, we can't watch sports and this is the workaround that we've figured out. But asking, what's a cut that you've made? For me personally, my phone was with AT&T for decades. And a couple years ago, I moved to Mint Mobile and I now pay, I think it's $240 for the whole year. That is a huge savings. Wow. But then also noting that my phone was paid for and not tied to my carrier, which it is for a lot of people. Also, it is an annual bill of $240, which is a huge hit in 1 month. But again, noting some of those nuances so that is this a switch that would apply to me? But sharing even just some of those easier wins is a nice, kind of easy win potentially for your friends too.
I mean, another simple example of that is like, they're not as prevalent now. And so maybe I'm dating myself, but like when the subscription service boxes were big, like what, 8 years ago? I don't know how long ago that was, but something like that, there were a bunch of people doing it and everybody was sharing, like, oh, my new box came in. And then they'd be like, I don't know if it was like that worth it. I mean, that's a simple conversation. Like, why do you keep getting it? Like maybe we should all cancel our boxes. How much a year is that box? Few $100s. That is a money conversation on a very entry level that allows you to like start talking about these things with your friends.
Yeah. And it feels much less heavy than how did you pick your, 401k contribution amount?
But I think so much of this is like the culture of your friendships and getting there.
Absolutely.
If you don't try, and also it's a process. Like you might have a conversation with your friend and feel like they really maybe judged your decision for money. And if you start having those conversations like, hey, I told you something that like I'm trying to work on, and it really seemed like you were judging me for that. And maybe they were judging you because they're dealing with the same thing, or maybe they grew up with a weird money story around that or whatever, like approaching it with curiosity, because you're never going to get to the bigger conversation if you don't start somewhere.
And also I'll add to that, if you try to open up a conversation and you have a friend that pretty quickly shuts it down and is clearly not receptive, okay, we respect that. We'll move on. Maybe this isn't the friend to go deep into financial conversations with. But also, you just kind of prying that door open ever so slightly might mean that when something comes up for them 6 months or a year from now, they now know that you're open to this conversation and you might be the friend that they are willing to have that conversation with. So a kind of rejected or shut down offering might not be kind of the end of it. So just give it time.
Just give it time. Also, I have friends I don't talk about money with. And that's not to say I never will, but currently I don't. And I just let that conversation go and move on. Like, it's okay. You don't have to do this with everyone, but there might be people that you wish you could, or that you feel, even, people who maybe you feel like do have a strong financial foundation and you'd love to know what they're doing and why they're doing it, and like start to see if any of that feels right for you. Not shying away from those. Okay, so I do want to close out this episode by talking a little bit about what if we're going to share numbers. I have some things that have worked for me. But I'd love to hear any thoughts you have about like actually sharing very specific details with anybody.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the first thing, we talked about it before, but this might not be a step you get to with everyone or anyone. And that's totally okay. I think for a lot of people, having the ability to kind of, especially if there is some shame or embarrassment tied to it, to be able to kind of lift that off your shoulders and like speak it out loud is really helpful and cathartic. So if you would benefit from that, you know, finding someone that you can do that with, fantastic. But also recognizing like, okay, what exactly are you getting out of that? If you're sharing with a friend who is wildly further than you in terms of, you know, salary or net worth, might it just make you feel bad? Maybe, you know, just kind of be mindful of like what you'll actually get out of it. Or are you sharing it with a friend who you know is struggling significantly worse than you, and you are kind of looking for validation that you're not in that bad of a shape? Just making sure that this is a safe space that everyone will find some benefit in, I think is really important. And then really focusing on sharing from a place of respect and curiosity, I think is, yeah, just really helpful to come from that. And again, I talked before about money being connected to value and power, just recognizing that like that thought exists. It's not real, but in some ways it kind of is. So just, you know, being respectful of that. I think for a lot of people, talking about salary can be kind of a good entryway, especially talking to people who are in a similar industry can be helpful. You know, if you are a teacher, talking to your lawyer friend might not be that helpful. But if you are at a marketing agency and your friend at another marketing agency, like that can be really insightful to understand that they're making more or less, why that might be. Is it because they have more education? Is it because it's a bigger company? Is it because they negotiated? How do you do that?
Yeah, I was going to say, like, I have some personal examples for this. I have multiple friends who know each other's salary. I don't necessarily know all their salaries, but they work, you know, like they could apply for each other's jobs kind of thing. And especially male-female friendships for pay gap transparency or racial pay gap transparency. We have a lot of friends who have shared with each other to help each other out that way. And I think an undershared one, we have people who've shared what their benefits are. Not like they've pulled out their benefits package and like handed over the table. Like there's, you know, what are your matches percentages? How many days off do you get? What do you get paid out if you don't? Like that also, those are numbers. That is value.
Yes. And I think most people don't even fully understand the potential dollar value of the benefits that they get and how vastly they can vary from company to company.
Like, do you pay premiums for your health insurance? That could be hundreds of dollars a month that somebody's paying, that even though you make the same amount of money or similar or whatever, like that can be helpful.
Yeah. And your friend who makes $10K more, but is paying for their own health insurance or paying a, you know, significant amount
or
of
has
their
a high
premiums,
deductible plan
and doesn't have a 401k match, may actually end up with less overall compensation than you making $10,000 less, but not having to pay a premium for your health insurance and getting a 4% match. You could be making significantly more overall if you really compare all of those details.
Which is then something you can negotiate, look for in a new position. That is useful numbers that aren't even necessarily your overall pay.
Yes. I don't think there's much vulnerability in sharing your benefits package, you know, in sharing what your company's match is or what your insurance premiums. I don't think people are feeling vulnerable or potentially judged about that. So that can also be an easy kind of gateway into the overall compensation.
So some other specific numbers that I've shared before are, you don't necessarily need to lay out all your numbers. So
yes, correct.
I had a small group of women and we used to meet and I would share my P&L, like my business finances. So I don't know my personal finances, but that's like vulnerable still. Like, how am I as a business owner managing this business? What choices am I making? And we would like line item. Why are you spending on that subscription? Why did you hire that contractor? And so much of it was about accountability and also resource sharing. And it's just hard when you're a solopreneur to balance all of that. But that could be whether it is a P&L, whether it is your grocery budget and like what the breakdown of that is. It could just be specific numbers for one segment of your life.
Yeah, I think that's especially helpful. I mean, understanding what your friend spends in a month overall, fascinating. You know, it's very interesting, but there's so many variables that go into that. One, what is their income and how much of a percentage is every individual line item there? They might pay very different rent for a multitude of reasons. They might spend more on groceries because they, need to eat gluten-free and that's just really expensive or whatever it might be. So if you are comparing your actual expenses or budget with people, I think kind of taking it with a grain of salt, don't see them think, oh, I spend too much on insert X and I need to change because of that. But it can be a helpful data point to see what's different. But I think your point of focusing on a specific category and essentially creating an accountability buddy can be really helpful in, I'm going to try to stick to this much on eating out or clothes or whatever it is. That can be really helpful.
And I was going to say, if you don't want to do like a number, a dollar amount, do a percentage. Like another great question, I've talked with people about is like your mortgage. What percentage is that of your take home pay? Are you above or below 28%? Again, like I'm not just like asking that question at a cocktail party. This is like a deep conversation I'm having with a friend where we're both like openly sharing and like discussing about finances. But I don't need to know how much. In fact, I know some friends' rents. I don't think I know a single friend's mortgage, but I do have some sense of what friends maybe bought when interest rates were lower. And so their percentage to take home pay, like ratio, is super low. Or which ones have bought recently and they feel a little maxed out. And like what they spend per month, dollar amount doesn't matter. But the percentage then opens up, obviously, these conversations of like understanding like, oh, they don't want to go out. Again, this is a deeper layer. They could just tell you that. But you don't have to share the dollar amount is all I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And I think understanding like, why are you sharing this? If you want to just share everything because you want someone to be fully transparent with, fantastic. Go ahead and do that. But to your point of how much are you spending on your mortgage, that's not as helpful as how does your mortgage payment impact your overall financial situation? Yeah, I think that's a really good perspective.
I hope that this episode helps some people think about whatever their comfort level is. Like for anybody that's listening to this and hearing maybe the conversations I'm having with friends, please remember that I'm married to a tax accountant who is friends with a lot of tax accountants. They discuss finance a lot. So the mechanics and things is something they're very used to. And we've been doing this now, like talking about finances with our friends on various levels for multiple decades. So don't feel like you need to come in here and be sharing percentages of your mortgage. Like start out, that's why we did these layers. Start out with the most basic of things and take it one step at a time. Sarah, what closing thoughts do you have for people who want to talk with their friends a little bit more about money?
One other thing, going back to the sharing numbers that I wanted to add was that people can have the same number, whether that was net worth, what they're contributing to their retirement account, or how much they're spending on their rent or mortgage, and feel very differently about the same numbers. I get a lot of clients who are, oh my gosh, I have so much credit card debt and it's $5,000. And then I get the next client who calls me and says, I am so proud. I have paid off almost all my credit card debt. I only have $5,000 left. Like you can have such a different perspective based on so many things from, what your journey has been, what messages you received as a child, what your peers are doing. So recognize if you're about to share a specific number, if you're about to also kind of regurgitate a ton of emotion attached to it, just be mindful that your friend might be like, oh, you're ashamed about your 120K salary because you think it should be more. And I'm thrilled that I'm finally making 80K. So yeah, just kind of keep in mind that we all have very different feelings about potentially the exact same numbers.
And I think it really, really isn't about the numbers.
Yes.
Because what somebody does with 100K salary, if we put 10 people in front of us, is going to be vastly different. Somebody's going to go out and buy a fancy car. Somebody's going to buy a house. Somebody's going to house hack. Somebody's going to travel around the world. Somebody's saved 90,000 a year and spending 10. Like, it really has nothing to do with the number. Everybody's going to do it different, like you were saying. And then do they feel good about that?
Mm-hmm.
And like, if you did that, would you want that? I think so much of this money conversation is really just about being more curious.
Absolutely.
And then neutral, trying to find some neutrality. Like, the way you do it isn't right or wrong. It's just right for you in this current moment. And just using it to explore like other ways to live.
Yeah, exactly. I think we've talked about asking why people do what they do is great for you to understand why they're doing it. Does that fit for you? Does that not? And sometimes even just being asked why yourself and trying to articulate it, you might realize that you have never considered why, and you've just always done it this way. Or the reason you started doing it a decade ago, you had a great reason for doing it then, and that no longer applies to you. So all of that, being curious, I think it's going to help both of you.
I would agree with that. And I also think I want to close out this episode by just saying that friends are great and I want more conversations, but there also are times for experts like you where you really can lay out all of your numbers, your scenario, your goals, your everything, and like be really held on that journey by someone who is creating space and capacity for that and also has the knowledge for that that your friends may not have. Like, there is a level here that your friends can't meet.
Yes, especially if you have any financial trauma or is just particularly challenging, feels like more vulnerable than you're prepared to be. Absolutely, talking with a professional can be hugely beneficial there.
It's like we say, your friends can't be your therapist. Your friends can't be your financial coach, but they can be a really great place to have some of these conversations. Sarah, thanks so much for being here today. We will put all your handles and all your website and all your things in the show notes so that people can come find you.
Fantastic. It was a pleasure having this conversation with you.
Can you hear my smile in my voice? Because I am grinning ear to ear. I am so happy we're kicking off 2024 with this episode. I can't wait to have more conversations about money and friendship and community and connection. And as you heard me say in the episode, I just really firmly believe that we all have resources we're working with: our time, energy, attention, finances. And one of those is finances. Like, this is important. So that's why I want to have these types of conversations, even if they're hard, even if it's hard to navigate this and figure it out. And you have, like some vulnerability hangovers or causes some big life shifts. Like, the hard conversations are so worth having, and I'm so happy to have them here. So thank you for tuning in. This will not be the last one. I want to remind you that in the show notes, we have links to Sarah's website and social media. I'll just tell you right now, you can go find her website, sarahroller.com. Sarah's with an H. And if you head to friendshipirl.com/unexpected expenses, all one word, that'll take you directly to Sarah's freebie that she has where you can download a copy of her unexpected expenses spreadsheet. With that, thanks, friends. Talk to you next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of Friendship IRL. I am so honored to have these conversations with you, but don't let the chat die here. Send me a voice message. I created a special website just to chat with you. You can find it at alex.chat. You can also find me on Instagram. My handle at It's Alex Alexander, or go ahead and leave a review wherever you prefer to listen to podcasts. Now, if you want to take this conversation a step further, send this episode to a friend. Tell them you found it interesting and use what we just talked about as a conversation starter the next time you and your friend hang out. No need for a teary goodbye. I'll be back with a new episode next week.